During the Cold War, USA paid people in the Middle East to overthrow the communist regimes and set up democratic ones. The CIA funded the Baathists to overthrow the incumbent Iraqi government. Saddam was not the initial president after that coup, although he was a senior figure in the party. He gradually worked his way into the presidency over the following decade. Saddam came into power in 1979, and the US was initially willing to work with him because his first order of business less than a year into office was invading Iran. This was not long after the hostage crisis, and any enemy of Iran could find support from the US at that time. Funding dictators has been a trope of US imperialism. From Augusto Pinochet, fascist dictator of Chile, to about 50 other right-wing dictators in the last century, Saddam Hussein was just one of many. Iraq is a country located in the Middle East. It has a long and complex history that spans thousands of years. The modern history of Iraq is marked by political upheaval, regional conflicts, and internal struggles. After gaining independence from British rule in 1932, Iraq experienced a series of coups and political transitions. The monarchy faced challenges, leading to the establishment of a republic in 1958 through a military coup. The era that followed witnessed a turbulent period characterized by political instability and power struggles. For the last 40 years, Iraq has been caught in a cycle of conflict as it tries to figure out a good way to govern itself and meet the needs of its diverse population. This problem became worse because of Saddam Hussein, who created a cruel government that put his interests above the well-being of his people. This was very different from his earlier role as vice president in the 1970s, when Iraq made big improvements socially and economically under his leadership. However, starting in the 1980s, his rule became more controlling and harmful, undoing much of the progress that had been made. While Saddam's regime was especially brutal and oppressive, it continued a pattern of political instability that Iraq had been experiencing since the 1920s. British control. In the early 20th century, Iraq found itself under British control following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. The country emerged as a new entity, but the British, disregarding the wishes of the majority Shiite population, appointed Sunni leaders to positions of power. They established a monarchy with Faisal I as the king, but Iraqis felt their sovereignty was compromised as Britain retained control over foreign affairs and the country's oil supply. During World War II, Iraqi nationalists led by Rashid Ali Gailani sought to counterbalance British influence by aligning with Germany. In 1941, they briefly seized power in a coup, but the British swiftly invaded and reoccupied the country, restoring the monarchy. This event revealed Iraq's underlying instability and discontent among the people. In the post-war era, Britain recognized the growing strength of nationalism in the Middle East and realized it could no longer maintain its vast empire. In Iraq, the desire to expel the British became widespread, leading to protests and strikes in 1948 and 1952. Arab nationalism gained momentum, fueled by influential thinkers like Sati al-Husri, and inspired by the success of the 1952 Egyptian Revolution, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Politically conscious military officers in Iraq, influenced by these developments, organized themselves and sought to emulate Nasser's free officer movement. The Arab Cold War further fueled government instability in Iraq from 1952 to 1970. The country experienced a cycle of coups, political turmoil, and shifts in power. Iraq's history during this period encapsulates the struggles of the Middle East, with imperial control, nationalism, and power struggles shaping its trajectory. The actions of the British, the rise of Arab nationalism, and the aspirations of military officers all played significant roles in shaping Iraq's political landscape. These events laid the foundation for the challenges Iraq would face in the later decades, including the rule of Saddam Hussein and the subsequent conflicts that gripped the nation. Early life. Saddam Hussein was born in 1937 into a poor family near the town of Tikrit in Iraq. In his early years, he became involved in politics and joined the Ba'ath Party in Baghdad. The Ba'ath Party aimed to unite Arab nations and eradicate foreign imperialism from the region. In 1958, Saddam participated in an attempt to assassinate the Iraqi Prime Minister, Abdel Karim Qasim, who had overthrown the monarchy in the July Revolution. However, the assassination plot failed, and Saddam was forced to flee to Egypt to escape arrest and potential retaliation. Saddam returned to Iraq in 1963 after a successful coup led by members of the Ba'ath Party. The coup resulted in the overthrow of the government, and the Ba'ath Party assumed power. tensions soon emerged between President Abdul Salam Arif and the Ba'athist leader Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr regarding the distribution of power within the new Iraqi government. During this time, discussions of unification between Iraq and Syria took place. Al-Bakr, wanting to establish a fully Ba'athist regime, expelled non-Ba'athist members from the government to ensure the party's control and influence. These events marked the initial steps in Saddam Hussein's rise to power within the Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi government. The tensions between President Arif and al-Bakr laid the groundwork for future power struggles, while the discussions of unification reflected the broader aspirations of Arab nationalism and pan-Arab unity prevalent during that era in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein began striving for power within the government, but negotiations for unity between the Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq fell apart, causing a split. President Arif saw the weakened state of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and launched a counter-coup against them, putting a stop to Saddam's plans. Saddam and many other members were imprisoned. After Arif's presidency ended due to a plane crash, his brother took over, and a bloodless coup was triggered to install al-Bakr as the new president in 1968. Saddam was released from prison and became al-Bakr's vice president. He took on the task of purging the government by imprisoning, torturing, or executing dissidents. The power gain. In 1979, Saddam convinced al-Bakr to retire, allowing him to become the new president of Iraq. He ordered the execution of numerous high-ranking officers to consolidate his power. At the age of 42, Saddam achieved his goal of becoming the fifth president of Iraq. Seeking to demonstrate the strength of Iraqi Arabs and solidify his power, Saddam needed an enemy to rally the people against. He chose Iran as the target due to several reasons. Iran had recently undergone a revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini, establishing a Shiite theocracy. They were perceived as disorganized, unproven, and had many adversaries. Furthermore, Iran expressed intentions to spread its theocratic influence to neighboring secular nations like Iraq. However, not all of Saddam's motivations were based solely on ideology. There were underlying goals, potentially multiple ones, driving his actions. The absurd politics. On September 22, 1980, Saddam Hussein declared war on Iran with several goals in mind. He aimed to annex the predominantly Arab region of Khuzestan, secure control over the Shatt al-Arab waterway connecting the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and gain access to oil fields along the Gulf shoreline. Saddam's military strategy was based on his own decisions, despite lacking military education. He divided his army into thirds, with one portion moving through the north, another through the center, and the remaining through the south. However, his invasion did not go as planned. The Iranians rallied behind Ayatollah Khomeini, strengthening his rule, and Saddam overestimated his army's abilities. The Iraqi forces found themselves overstretched and faced difficulties in retreating. Saddam executed several generals who suggested retreating. Eventually, Iraq was forced onto the defensive, and Saddam considered a unilateral ceasefire. However, Iran refused and demanded Saddam's removal from power, leading to Iran's Operation Ramadan. During the war, Iraq relied on oil trading through third-party countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to sustain its economy. Iran targeted Iraq's oil shipments, leading many world powers to support Iraq against Iran. Iran launched numerous attacks but faced heavy losses due to chemical weapons and artillery barrages. By 1988, Iran had exhausted itself with persistent failures. Iraq, with increased resources and a focus on mechanized warfare, launched a counterattack. A ceasefire was eventually accepted, though both sides claimed victory. The war resulted in over 1 million deaths and lasting scars on Middle Eastern affairs, without significant territorial gains for either side. After the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq was left devastated and heavily in debt, needing to rebuild its oil infrastructure and economy. Kuwait, however, made this difficult by demanding repayment of debts while dropping oil prices and exceeding their quotas, undermining Iraq's market position. Kuwait further provoked Iraq by drilling into the Rumaila oil field on the border, violating Iraqi borders. Operation Desert Shield, George H.W. Bush intervened in the conflict and determined that Kuwait should pay $10 billion in compensation. The Emir of Kuwait, Jaber III, only paid back $9 billion, which angered Saddam Hussein. In response, Saddam declared war and invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990, citing historical claims to the land. Within 2 days, Iraq had conquered Kuwait. The United Nations denounced Saddam's actions and imposed sanctions on Iraq, but he declared Kuwait as Iraq's 19th province. Saddam also deployed troops to Iraq's borders with Saudi Arabia, causing concern for the US and its allies. In response, the US and other NATO nations initiated Operation Desert Shield, deploying troops to Saudi Arabia. Saddam had declared jihad against the West and its allies, but only a few responded to his call. Meanwhile, President Bush rallied a coalition of countries including the UK, France, Australia, and Saudi Arabia to oppose Saddam. Saddam sent a list of demands to President Bush, including an Israeli withdrawal from Palestinian lands, Iraqi access to the Persian Gulf, and a beneficial trade deal with the US. However, President Bush swiftly denied these demands, leading to a buildup of tensions. Overall, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and the subsequent international response set the stage for a confrontation between Saddam Hussein's forces and the coalition led by the United States. On November 29, 1990, the UN Security Council authorized the use of force against Iraq if Saddam Hussein didn't withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991. Then on January 17, 1991, a massive air campaign led by the United States called Operation Desert Storm attacked Iraq's defenses. The bombing campaign lasted until mid-February and severely damaged Iraq's military capabilities. Operation Desert Saber followed, which involved ground offensives by the coalition forces to push back Iraqi forces and secure Kuwait. As the Iraqis retreated, they employed a scorched earth strategy, destroying oil wells along their path. President Bush decided to pursue a ceasefire, which was signed on February 28, 1991, ending the Gulf War. Bush recognized the potential instability of occupying Iraq and removing Saddam's regime, which could lead to a fragmented and war-torn country. Under the ceasefire terms, Saddam agreed to recognize Kuwait's sovereignty and the leadership of Jabr III. A no-fly zone was established in the northern region of Iraq, and Saddam was required to dismantle weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear, biological, and chemical arms. After the peace agreement, the US encouraged the Kurds and Shiites in Iraq to rise up against Saddam and initiate regime change. However, when the US failed to provide sufficient support, Saddam swiftly crushed their uprisings. This indicated to the US that while Saddam's regional power had been weakened, his oppressive rule within Iraq would persist with no end in sight. World politics: Iraq had suffered greatly from its past conflicts, with widespread unrest and economic sanctions pushing people into crime or starvation. Saddam Hussein managed to suppress 2 coup attempts in 1992 and 1993 and used brutal tactics to punish dissenters. The United Nations continued to pressure Saddam to comply with resolutions that required him to destroy his stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. Saddam repeatedly defied the Security Council, refusing to cooperate fully and only allowing enough room for negotiation when threatened with force. On September 11, 2001, the world was shocked by the attacks on the World Trade Center. Saddam publicly applauded the attacks, viewing them as a blow to his enemies. President George W. Bush, although not directly linking Saddam to the attacks, considered him a threat in the new era of global terrorism. He famously included Iraq in the axis of evil alongside Iran and North Korea. In November 2002, the UN passed Resolution 1441, accusing Iraq of violating Security Council resolutions and warning of serious consequences. President Bush, unlike his father, believed that Saddam had to be forcibly removed from power. He formed a coalition with the US, UK, Australia, and Poland to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom, aimed at stripping Saddam of his power and alleged weapons of mass destruction. Towards the end, the coalition led by President Bush offered Saddam Hussein a chance to leave Iraq and avoid invasion, but Saddam refused, as he had never backed down from a war before. He declared to his people that they would be victorious against aggression. After the deadline passed, the coalition launched its campaign of shock and awe, which aimed to intimidate the Iraqi people. Coalition troops pushed into Iraq from Kuwait, facing the threat of chemical attacks and guerrilla warfare. It took 3 weeks for the coalition forces to defeat the Iraqi army and secure Baghdad and other major cities. President Bush announced that major combat operations had ceased on May 1, 2003, declaring mission accomplished. However, the situation became more complex as numerous insurgencies emerged in Iraq after the defeat of conventional military forces. The US attempted to stabilize the country by supporting the Shiite faction, leading to tensions and suppression of the Sunni population. Saddam Hussein was captured in Tikrit on December 13, 2003. Saddam Hussein's regime was marked by severe human rights abuses and crimes against humanity. One of the most notorious acts was the Anfal campaign, which targeted Iraq's Kurdish population. This brutal campaign involved mass killings, forced displacement, and the use of chemical weapons. The town of Halabja witnessed a horrific chemical attack, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Kurdish civilians. Saddam's regime also ruthlessly suppressed political dissent, resorting to torture, arbitrary arrests, and extrajudicial killings to silence opposition. The discovery of mass graves after his regime's fall revealed the extent of the crimes committed, with thousands of victims found. Shia Muslims, despite being the majority in Iraq, also faced repression, discrimination, and mass arrests under Saddam's rule. Saddam Hussein was held accountable for his actions through the legal process. He faced trial by the Iraqi Special Tribunal, established to prosecute those responsible for serious crimes during his regime. Saddam Hussein was found guilty of crimes against humanity related to the killing of 148 Shia Muslims in Dujail in 1982, following an assassination attempt against him. After the trial and subsequent appeals, he was sentenced to death by hanging. Saddam Hussein's execution took place on December 30, 2006, marking the end of his rule and his legal responsibility for the crimes committed during his time in power. However, Iraq struggled to rebuild, and the U.S. remained involved in the country until 2011 when they withdrew their forces. The aftermath left Iraq in a state of uncertainty and unrest. Iraq has been trapped in a cycle of ruthless dictators and chaotic anarchy since its formation in 1918. Saddam Hussein, while deserving of criticism, was just one devil among many. His removal only paved the way for the rise of new threats like ISIS. Today, we face similar challenges in countries like Syria, where the West claims to be championing democracy while often engaging in bullying tactics. Aftermath. The removal of Saddam Hussein in 2003 led to a power vacuum and unleashed violence and instability in Iraq that persists to this day. Under Saddam's rule, Iraqis suffered from widespread human rights abuses and lived under harsh international sanctions. However, the lack of effective planning and foresight after the invasion worsened the situation. Critical errors, such as the de-Baathification policy and disbanding of the Iraqi military without a proper plan, exacerbated instability and allowed armed groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to emerge. Iraq continues to grapple with the consequences of these challenges. The post-invasion political system in Iraq, designed by outsiders, failed to genuinely include the voice of the Iraqi people. The arrangement of having a Shia prime minister, a Kurdish president, and a Sunni Speaker of Parliament served the interests of those who devised it, but did not reflect the desires and needs of the Iraqi population. Despite initial hopes for democracy, the U.S. invasion in 2003 led to a flawed political system and ongoing controversy. The lack of adequate planning after the U.S. invasion of Iraq led to critical mistakes by the Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA. The implementation of the de-Baathification policy resulted in a breakdown of governmental functions as many lost their jobs. Disbanding the Iraqi military created a power vacuum, enabling the emergence of armed groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These actions contributed to a collapse of security and ongoing challenges in Iraq's recovery. The design of the new political system in Iraq, primarily by outsiders, did not genuinely involve the Iraqi people. The arrangement where the prime minister is always Shia, the president is Kurdish, and the Speaker of Parliament is Sunni was not representative of the desires and needs of the entire population. It served the interests of those who devised it but did not reflect the broader Iraqi population. In conclusion, the history of Saddam Hussein in Iraq is marked by brutality, human rights abuses, and the devastating consequences of his rule. For over 2 decades, Saddam Hussein wielded power with an iron fist, committing horrific acts of violence against his own people, including chemical weapons attacks on the Kurds. Iraq under his regime was isolated, facing international sanctions that further exacerbated the suffering of its citizens. The legacy of Saddam Hussein's rule and the subsequent invasion continue to impact Iraq as the country struggles to rebuild, stabilize, and reconcile its troubled past. It's important to learn from history, but the reality is that history is still unfolding every day. We can hope for peace and prosperity in the region, but it's hard to say when or if that will happen. Sometimes the future seems bleak, and we can only hope for a better ending, but history has a way of repeating itself. In the end, the outcome may not be a neat and happy resolution, but rather something more unpredictable and uncertain.